So we are going to look at a nerve now. You'll be able to identify, draw, or label components of a nerve, explain what signals are found on what roots, and where the different rami's go, and you'll state how many cervical, lumbar, sacral, thoracic, and coccygeal nerves there are. So, spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs. There are 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. That doesn't make sense because there's only 7 cervical vertebrae. So here's the spinal cord, and this is the cervical region. So we have our cervical enlargement, then our thoracic region. And I'm going to draw the first vertebrae. Do you remember what that's called? Correct, that is atlas. And do you remember what the second one's called? Correct, axis. Axis, and I'm going to just draw in the remaining 5 as well. So here are my 7 cervical vertebrae. Now C1 is going to exit above the atlas, so C1, and C2 above the axis. Continues all the way down to C7. C1 through C7 are going to exit above the vertebrae they are named after. C8 right here is going to exit below the 7th cervical vertebrae. C8, let's do a rainbow glitter, is exiting below the 7th cervical vertebrae. So, thoracic nerve T1 is going to exit below the first thoracic vertebrae. Thoracic nerve T2 exits below. T3 exits below the 3rd thoracic, and all the way to T12. So the thoracic nerves are named for the vertebrae they exit below. Same for the lumbar. L1 exits below the first lumbar vertebrae. L2 exits below. So L1 through L5 exit below. And sacral 1 through sacral 5 exit through the foramen in the sacrum, but technically during development they're below. And coccyx 1, that's a little weird nerve. It's technically starting below as well. In summary, the first 7 cervical vertebrae exit superior. C8 exits inferior to the 7th cervical vertebrae. Then everything else is exiting inferior to its vertebrae. Now, we have our nerve here. We have our anterior root and our posterior root. Now, let's say I want to move an arm. What's going to happen is the signal originates at the anterior horn. It's going to go out my anterior root. A branch right after this anterior root. A branch is called a ramus. So to go to the arm's in front of you, I think, I'm going to take this anterior ramus. Right there. Now let's say I have an itch in my back. Itch is going to come from receptors over here in the back, and it's going to follow this posterior branch called the posterior ramus, go through my posterior root to my posterior horn. Yes, I forgot this whole body. There it is. So there's 2 branches right when the spinal nerve leaves. One is called the anterior branch or anterior ramus. The other is the posterior. Now, the posterior ramus is very boring. We have an itch. So that signal is going to go on the posterior ramus through the posterior root to the posterior horn. Now, let's say you are looking at yourself in the mirror. You're not standing upright, so you want to erect your back with the erector spinae. That signal is going to originate in the anterior horn. It's going to go out the anterior root, becomes part of the nerve, then it's going to go out this posterior ramus. So, the posterior ramus is very boring. It is going to the deep muscles of the back and to the skin, and it receives sensory signals from the back. So it's a very boring ramus. That must mean this anterior one is very exciting. So here is our posterior root and our anterior root. They merge to form the nerve, and we have a very boring posterior or dorsal ramus. The anterior ramus is more exciting. It is going to form a lot of cool structures. So it is going to have these communicating rami communicants, going to something called a sympathetic ganglia, but that is next chapter. It is going to go to these things called plexes. And the plexes actually control muscles to your arms and legs. So that's very exciting. And it also goes between your ribs. So the anterior rami is very, very exciting. To skeletal muscles, body wall, where the dorsal rami or posterior is very boring. Now, because of this, we have something called a dermatome. A dermatome is a segment of skin supplied by a single nerve. And I'm not going to make you memorize which dermatomes where. That is for a more advanced class. But let's look at T10 for a second. This map, this region right here, is what is controlled by thoracic nerve T10 for sense as well. Now in reality, T10 extends down, and it covers about 50% of what T11 covers. And it also goes up, and it covers about 50% of T9. So this nerve actually is responsible for sensory information for a large area, but it is 100% in this region. T9 is the same way. It is covering this dermatome completely, but it actually overlaps like so. And it's going to overlap into T8 by 50%. Likewise, T11 completely covers this region, but it also covers that region as well. So a dermatome is the segment of skin supplied by a single spinal nerve, but they have 50% overlap. So let's say to remove the appendix, which is right there, you'd have to actually knock out T9, 10, and T11. Signals going to the back are on the anterior ramus, posterior ramus, or lateral ramus. Well, there's no lateral ramus. And back, which one's back? It is posterior. Students have a lot of trouble with this question for some reason. Which is paired wrong? 7 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. It's this one. There's 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 nerves. True or false? All cervical vertebrae, or nerves, exit superior to their vertebrae, and the remainder exit inferior. False. C1 through C7, superior. C8 is inferior. So we're going to look at plexes now. And a plexus is just a weave coming off of the anterior ramus. You'll be able to draw or identify structures on the brachial plexus for me. Identify the major nerves. This is going to be an online activity. And you will explain or identify each plexus on the lab exam. So, a plexus is just a weave coming off of a given area where the nerves sort of twist and tangle and reform new nerves. So this right here is a very beautiful plexus. That's the brachial plexus, and that goes to the arm. Now down here we have 2 weaves. This one that's around the lumbar area is called the lumbar plexus. This one's called the sacral. Sometimes it's called the lumbosacral plexus. And then we have the cervical plexus. So they all originate from the anterior rami. So remember, we have our posterior root, our anterior root, they come together, forms a nerve, then we have this very sad posterior ramus, and this very exciting anterior ramus. So let's make it bigger. Cervical plexus, is going to go to the neck, and it actually hooks up with the hypoglossal nerve. The brachial plexus, as the name implies, is in the leg, and the lumbar and sacral plexus go to the legs. To know which nerve is in which plexus and where they go. So for a cervical plexus, C1 through C5 form the cervical plexus, and then we have the hypoglossal nerve hooking up as well. Here's part of the hypoglossal nerve, then C1 through C5. Now, the main nerve off of this, only nerve I want you to know on this is the phrenic nerve. It's very important. It goes to the diaphragm, your main respiratory muscle. And it actually comes off at about between C2 and C3. So a severed spine right there, no more phrenic nerve. The brachial plexus is going to the armpit and is going to the arm. Uh-oh, C5 is doubling up. Look at that. Cervical is C1 to C5. Brachial is C5 to T1. Now, the lumbar plexus. Now, the lumbar plexus is in the lower back right here. And it's L1 to L4. And it goes to the anterior thigh, the medial thigh, and the pelvis. The sacral plexus is L4 to S4. It is going to give rise to the sciatic nerve, and it goes to the posterior thigh and the lower leg. So C5 doubles up between the two plexes. L4 also is going to double up between two plexes.